Welcome to Season 3 of the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. Those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy-up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today we have Dr. Floyd Toole with us. If you're an ongoing listener of this podcast, you've certainly heard Dr. Floyd Toole's name come up throughout numerous episodes. He is a living legend in the audio space, previously a senior research officer at the National Research Council, as well as a corporate vice president, acoustical engineering at Harman International. Welcome, Dr. Toole.
Thank you, Jorden. Pleasure to be here.
So you have a very long history in audio and the hi-fi world. There is a lot that we can talk about, and I think we are going to talk about today. But if we bring it back to the very beginning, was there like a very specific experience that you had that kind of instigated this path, this lifelong path that you had in audio? Was there a memory that you can kind of point to and say, this is where it all began, this is what sparked my interest?
No, it was a very messy beginning, actually, and chance played a huge factor in it. As a teenager, I was interested in audio, and my father as well, at a very primitive level. Dad built, he was a consummate handyman, and so we had a workshop in the basement, and he built loudspeakers in boxes that had designs that were published in magazines, not that they were anything to write home about at all. Quite the contrary, they were dreadful, some of them. But we persevered. It was a time of trial and error in those years, and so you buy a loudspeaker and you build a box or buy a box, and you put the two together, and if it works, it'll make sound. There's no doubt. You can whistle a melody and tap your foot to the rhythm always, but beyond that, sound quality was a big question mark. And frankly, even then, I think we appreciated that it was not all that good, frankly, because loud was the big deal back in those days. And, because tube amplifiers weren't very powerful and loudspeakers tend not to be very efficient, especially in those days. And so, getting the most out of a loudspeaker was, an amplifier combination was considered to be a benchmark achievement. And so louder was better, whether it sounded good or not. And bass was significantly lacking in any of the systems that I can remember. Not even subwoofer territory bass. It was just it was awful. But anyway, it was a beginning, and my interest was really stimulated when after the war, my dad took advantage of an opportunity to get some war surplus materials from a nearby airport where they repaired damaged planes. They'd be able to fly back to Canada for repair and then back to do battle again in World War II. Yeah. After the war, there was just an enormous heap of rubbish around. I mean, parts of airplanes and parts of radar systems and parts of just about anything you can name that has war material attached to it. And for $5 a truckload, you could take home as much of this stuff as you wanted. And we did. We spent $10 to get 2 truckloads. And so amongst it was, there were 2 jukeboxes and lots of electronics from probably primitive radar sites. And I just dismantled the stuff and cataloged the resistors and capacitors and then started to build things. I built a couple of power amplifiers and from published designs, and a preamplifier from another design I cribbed from somewhere. And so I had my own do-it-yourself audio system, and it was loud, and I was proud.
And this was when you were like an early teenager type.
This is definitely my teens. This is my teens. Yeah,
amazing.
So that was my audio interest. But the electronics side of it really caught hold. And when I went to university, I specialized in electrical engineering, and within that, eventually electronics. I was pretty good at it. I don't know that I was exceptional. My maths was functional. And I felt it was something worth doing or continuing with, because the transistor had just been invented, and really I was among the first generation of electrical engineering students that had any solid state physics training. And I thought, well, the transistor is a new thing. Here's an opportunity for the future to become a transistor circuit designer. So I kept that in the back of my mind. And when I graduated with good grades, and the dean of engineering called me to his office and kind of gave me a little father-son kind of talk. I said, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? In the summer months, I had been working for the telephone company, starting with the New Brunswick Telephone Company in my late high school years, and then Bell Telephone in Montreal for my university years. And I was sufficiently adept at it that for the last 2 years, I was paid as a graduate engineer, even though I hadn't graduated. And for the last year, I had my own engineering group that I was supervising and touring around in toll area engineering. We'd fly out Monday morning to some location in Quebec or Ontario, usually, that would need some kind of attention or calibration or setup engineering activity. And it was quite exciting stuff, and I liked it. So he suggested, the dean suggested that, well, of course, Bell Telephone wanted me to stay on. That's really the crux of the matter. I had a decision: do I stay with Bell? And as they were promising me, they'd educate me and move me up the management ladder, and an officer of some description within that structure, or go on, continue my academic studies. And the dean thought that the latter was the choice, and my father did as well. He said, no, my son, you just carry on. And so I did. And I applied for a couple of scholarships because I didn't have the money to fund my own postgraduate education. And by the greatest of good chance, well, I think I had something to do with it, actually, but I had good grades. And so I applied for 2 scholarships, and I got both of them. One was an Athlone Fellowship, and the other was a Lord Beaverbrook Overseas Scholarship. And both of these scholarships were remarkable. They paid for everything. The Lord Beaverbrook Scholarship paid a little more. They paid airfare to and from England to wherever I wanted to go, and I chose to go to England because I knew Canada and I knew the US up to a point. And I said, well, here's an opportunity to study abroad and see some of the world, because I came from a small town in New Brunswick, for goodness sakes. I had no experience in the wide, wicked world at all. And so I just thought this would be terrific. And off I went. I took the Beaverbrook, and they paid everything, books and tuition and travel. They gave me a living allowance and a bonus for a vacation so that we'd get a chance to go see something in Europe. And in the 4.5 years that I was there, I spent almost 6 months traveling in Europe. And
Whoa.
So it was quite an education of multiple kinds, really. I became a civilized person, culture, and learned about food and drink and music and art and theater and all those things that had no access to back in my previous life. So it changed me. But what also changed me, and this is where chance comes into it, I had applied for and got acceptance to a course on transistor circuit design at Imperial College, which was a very respected institute, part of the University of London. And so I turned up for registration day and had this letter in my hand saying, here I am, ready to go. And this little man looked at me and said, terribly sorry, Toole, but the course has been oversubscribed, and you students from the colonies, and he used the word colonies, will have to find something else to do. So here I am, 22 years old,
Across the pond.
Across the pond, you know, faced with this really very unpleasant situation. And so what do I do? Get drunk and go home, or settle back and find something else to do? Because here I was, all expenses paid, at the Imperial College of Science and Technology, and I thought to myself, there must be something else that I can learn that's useful to my future in this place. And I talked to the administration, and they said, well, you just have to go or shop around the various PhD supervisors and see what they're doing. And if anything that they're doing interests you and they're interested in supervising you, you've got a deal. But that's what you do. And so, okay, I started going from basically door to door in the university. And I tried a couple of things, but honest to God, they didn't make my juices flow at all. And I couldn't get interested in them. And then by greatest of pure chance, I ran into a man whose name I actually recognized. His name was Colin Cherry.
Okay.
And he'd been a professor at the university. He was recently retired. And he just came in from time to time. And I don't remember how we hooked up. But when we did, it was like magic. We liked each other, and we started to talk. And I had remembered he and one of his previous students, Leakey, had published an article in Wireless World, an English magazine, on stereo localization, which I knew about, and I made it my business to find out a little more about Colin Cherry. And turns out he's a famous man, was a famous man at the time. He created the term cocktail party effect.
No way.
No way. and so he was interested in binaural hearing. And stereophony, which was new at the time, of course, a few years old, 3 or 4 years old, was a fascination to him, because how can a human being with 2 ears and a brain sit in front of a pair of loudspeakers and get this soundstage panorama, and some sense of space and what have you? I mean, it wasn't real, but it was highly entertaining and quite complicated when you stop and think about it. Because you're doing this in a room, and all the reflected sounds and so on get in the way, and it's a challenge. And he said, it'd be interesting to learn more about the binaural hearing system, how it is that 2 ears and a brain get an apprehension of the three-dimensional world around us, this subconscious state. It just happened. And he said, this is not electrical engineering and not electronics, but he said, we could use your skills in transistor circuit design, or circuit. I can do valves as well as tubes as well as transistors. So we could use your skills there to create apparatus that would test the hearing system in ways that your predecessors in this field had not. Because most of the work being done in understanding binaural hearing had been done by experimental psychologists who were trained in a very different way from hardcore engineers. And they didn't know anything about signal analysis and Fourier transforms and spectrum and acoustical measurements and that sort of thing. It's all foreign to them. So they were doing acoustical tests on human beings and getting psychoacoustic data from those, but their ability to manipulate the sounds that the listeners were hearing was extremely limited. It was very, very limited.
Yeah.
Cherry thought I could do better. Long story short, he was right, and I took it on, and he introduced me to his last PhD student, Bruce Sayers, and he became my supervisor. Turns out that Bruce Sayers' thesis was on binaural hearing, and Bruce Sayers had created a theory on how some portions of the binaural system function. So he had a vested interest in the topic, and I thought, well, this is going to work out. So off we went, and gradually, it took me a while to get the apparatus built because I had to design and build circuitry. So I spent a few months really creating two 5-foot racks full of electronics tube and germanium transistors in those days, before silicon. So germanium transistors and vacuum tubes, two obsolete technologies. And but it all worked. And combined with some of the external apparatus, I could do quite sophisticated stuff with my signal creation. And of course, the signals that were created were delivered to listeners through headphones, because we wanted to control the sounds arriving at the two ears independently of one, so that we could really play tricks with the brain. And, so this is all what they then called lateralization, not localization, because sound images were inside your head. And I was using not realistic sounds at all. I was using clicks and pops and funny sounds with various spectral and time domain functions that exercise the binaural system in different ways to find out really what's going on inside. And anyway, so one thing led to another, and it was working out quite well. I actually built a pulse width modulated tape recorder. I bought one of these big 15-inch reels, 12-inch reel tape recorders and tape transports, and built the electronics for it to be able to record from DC to 200 hertz.
Okay.
Using pulse width modulated signals on the tape. And at the time, this was quarter-inch tape. At the time, it was Bogen, a German company, had just come out with a 4-track tape, and I had one of the very first products of that kind. So I did 4-track, 2 tracks to record the signals and 2 tracks to record the listeners' responses. And so I had masses of data accumulated, all in analog, because there were no digital data storage capabilities back then.
This was all, I'm trying to like put a date on this. This was all probably in the 60s?
Yes, it all began in 1961.
Okay.
And I graduated in 1965.
Okay.
So that's the time span. So things were pretty primitive in those days. And it was interesting because the headphones that I chose, and I cannot remember how they got selected at all, just that they were highly regarded. They were Sharp HA10s, and Sharp HA10 headphones were designed by Dr. Edgar Shaw at the National Research Council. And when I got there, eventually, flashing forward now, when I got to the NRC 5 years afterwards, he was in the office next to me. It's a small world. It's an amazingly small world. Anyway, they turned out to be very good headphones, and by any standards, even today's, I think they would be passable. So, that was that. We started to the results were very encouraging, and they were casting doubt on all of the prevailing theories of binaural hearing, showing a new path to understanding what really was going on. And we decided to start writing a paper for the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. It was the journal of choice of merit in those days, and still is in that area. And I would be the main author, but he would write, put his name first as the supervisor. This typical university pattern. And so we were working along, and I was carrying on the research and at writing this paper. And one day he turned up in my office saying, here, you might be interested in reading this. And it was a paper that he had written and had published on our topic, on my topic. It was a very simple experiment that he had done.
Yeah.
And the son of a gun had hired the technician from our lab to work at his apartment during the weekends. And he used the people in his apartment to do as subjects for the experiment. And he did it was just a rudimentary experiment, but he wanted to have his name first in the series of papers that we're going to follow. And so really from that point on, I didn't trust my supervisor because we were in competition with each other. I had really disproved his thesis. And, it was not a comfortable situation to be in. And here I was.
Now, this is all for academic purposes. There wasn't a commercial enterprise coming out of this. So him doing that to you was just for like academic accolades. Like it's not.
You bet.
Yeah.
You bet. Yeah.
Okay.
Pure and simple. It was pure and simple to be first in line with he started this idea. He didn't start the idea. I started that. But anyway, he said, she said kind of thing. It cast a shadow over the work from that point on. We continued to work together, and despite the awkwardness, and we published 3 papers before I graduated. It was very good, and they still exist. They're quoted in textbooks still, so it's kind of I'm very proud of that.
That's awesome.
Anyway, so the research was successful, and when I wrote up the thesis, so a thesis examiner, this is another little twist, was his thesis examiner. So the man who approved his thesis, which I had disproved, was examining my thesis.
What?
It's mind-bending, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, so there you go. Fortunately, I passed, and the last 2 years of my scholarship, Leavenworth scholarship was 2 years. And so the last 2 years or year and a half of my stay at the Imperial College were paid for by a National Research Council special scholarship, which was set up exactly for people in my situation.
So the NRC paid the last 2 years effectively knowing that you were going to repatriate back to Canada?
No, they had no guarantee of that at all.
Okay.
In fact, there were no conditions attached to it except that they would have the opportunity to interview me.
I mean, that's not a bad deal.
No. It's typically Canadian, isn't it? It's very, very generous and very thoughtful. And so I was interviewed, and it was a successful interview. They thought this was interesting. I mean, NRC had an acoustics group going in the Division of Applied Physics. And they had dabbled in psychoacoustics, but I was really headstrong into it. It was my purpose. It was my thesis topic. And so they thought there might be a marriage there. And so they made me an offer, which I accepted. And I had a job before I graduated.
Now, was there any other offers that came through from the commercial side of things? Like, you're in England.
Mm-hmm.
There's KEF.
That's a whole separate story. I got to know the people at KEF actually towards the end of my stay there. And Raymond Cook, the owner of KEF, started the company, and I became good friends. But that's a separate story, which you can pick up later on. But no, they weren't interested in what I was doing, because what I was doing was very academic compared to what they were doing, which was stuffing speakers into boxes.
Yeah.
Making highly variable sounds out of them. Quite frankly, they weren't consistent at all. Anyway, so I thought about staying in the UK because I liked life in London. Life in London in those years, 60 to 65, it was idyllic for us because we had little money and it was cheap. You could have seats in the gods, they called them, at least whatever performance you like, from opera right through to theater and concerts, what have you. We went to all of that stuff for a song financially. Amazing. When I got back to I guess culturally my horizons were greatly expanded through the years in London, and I wanted to continue it actually. And so I did a little looking around to find employment. Nobody was doing research that would pay money.
Yeah.
And the salaries that were being offered for things that I thought I was able to do were not very attractive. So NRC's attractive salary offer, which was not commercially competitive level money, but it was better than what I was being offered in England. I thought, no. But the NRC, from whatever I knew of it, was the place to be. It was
and that was the time for it as well, because there was a lot of money getting invested into the NRC for pure research.
Yes, there was. It was. I mean, politicians in those years believed in science, and for whatever reasons, the motivations of politicians, I won't try to predict, but for whatever reasons, they were funding it and benefiting from it. So I arrive at NRC, and they have an anechoic chamber, which I knew about, and it was indeed a good one, 3-foot wedges, so it would be anechoic down to 100 hertz easily. And so that would be a perfect place to continue my sound localization experiments, which started with headphones. And now I wanted to move it towards the real world, one step towards the real world, by having sounds originating in a non-reverberant or non-reflective space, a dead room, and then gradually move towards reflective rooms. Figure it all out in stages. So get in there. I need a loudspeaker, or need several loudspeakers for my tests to generate the sounds. And I'd never really paid much attention to loudspeakers in reality, except that they make music and I enjoy music. So I set up a loudspeaker in the anechoic chamber and measured it. I'd done lots of measurements on electronics, and in electronics, you want flat frequency response. I mean, it's just a rule. Nobody disobeys that rule. It's flat from DC to light if you can get it.
Yeah.
And so I measure these. There were 2 loudspeakers in the lab at the time. One was an AR3, research AR3, which was very highly regarded at the time, and a Tannoy Cadet, which was not the best of the Tannoy family of products, but it was a Tannoy. I measured them, and the curves were dreadful. Impossible. I thought to myself, good grief. If it were not for the fact that I was at NRC and having access to the best measurement apparatus that existed, frankly, at the time, I would have doubted the data, but the data were real. The curves were very curvaceous. It was very ripply, very rough, and not at all flat.
To your knowledge, did anyone test a speaker at all in an anechoic chamber at that point in time?
Oh, I think so. Yes. The answer is yes. But what were they aiming for? And that's where they came unstuck, because in the end they would go do a non-blind listening test, and with a few golden ear buddies hanging around, and musicians, if they could find musicians, because they always felt that musicians were the best judges of sound quality. It turns out that, frankly, it's the reverse. Musicians have a perspective on sound quality that ordinary audience goers don't have.
Interesting.
And they are not, in my experience over 50 years, not necessarily reliable listeners at all. Anyway, that's a second story. We can pick up on that if you want.
Yeah.
Sure.
So with that, I think we should take a quick little break. And then when we come back, we can dive into how the research at NRC kind of progressed and where it went from there.
Okay.
And welcome back. We are with Dr. Floyd Toole. And just before the break, we were talking about how Floyd made it to the NRC, was interested in doing research on binaural hearing and binaural listening, and then by almost happenstance measured speakers to then use in the experiment, and then take us from there.
Yes, well, I measured these 2 loudspeakers, and to my dismay, the curves that came out were absolutely not flat And I had only seen flat curves coming out of electronic measurements, and I thought to myself, can these possibly sound as bad as they look? Because they look dreadful. And even the ones, and they both have, followings. People bought these things and listened to them, presumably enjoy them. So I thought to myself, well, okay, I'm going to do a little experiment. My background in experimental psychology definitely held me in good stead there. Because one thing that I knew was that people could be very easily biased. So if I were going to do a subjective evaluation of these loudspeakers, it would have to be blind. So I just took a couple of rolls of bed sheeting and said, I'm going to hang up some bed sheeting and put some speakers, I'll get some more speakers, and I'll put a few more speakers in behind the screen. And make them equally loud, because I knew about equal loudness contours. And so if the loudness levels varied, so would the opinions, for no reason other than loudness. And so you have to make them equally loud. So the two variables that most people don't pay attention to, I did fortunately pay attention to. And so we conducted what was then called, not I, but called, it was sort of common practice, called a Friday afternoon experiment. A bunch of colleagues get together and have a little brainstorming session on a topic, and you might do a little experiment and see what happens. I mean, research is exploration. Nobody told me what to do. To research. By definition, you're doing something that nobody else has ever done. And if you don't do something that nobody else has ever done, then you're not doing research. So you're turning somebody else's crank. So this is kind of fun. And I thought to myself, I don't remember reading anything about blind listening tests. So I did it. Friday afternoon, just got a few of my colleagues together in a small room that was nondescript. Absolutely nothing about this was set up in any specialized way at all. And I measured all the loudspeakers. And one of the loudspeakers was a loudspeaker that I had brought back from England. I went to a hi-fi show the summer before my termination of my studies. And it was at the Russell Hotel, these tiny little rooms in the Russell Hotel. And I had chosen a Kef loudspeaker. Kef was a new company back then. I met Raymond Cook and got quite chummy, and he offered me a research discount on this baffle board with a couple of loudspeakers that are crossover on it. And I bought two of them. And I lied about the research, but turns out that it was real. Anyway, so I had the cabinet shop at the Research Council build up the boxes to put around the baffles. So I had these two loudspeakers that came from England, which I thought my uneducated ear decided sounded pretty good. And by golly, it won the test.
Oh, no way.
And it turns out that it also had the best looking measurements. Oh, says I, this is more than passing interesting. So maybe frequency response does matter, and maybe we can hear the benefits of flatter, smoother frequency responses. But the other thing that was very clearly demonstrated was that most people agreed on what was good and bad, in the product range. They all liked the same loudspeaker. Well, not all, a couple that didn't. Actually, the interesting thing, let's pick up on an earlier topic, the two that did not agree were musicians.
Oh, interesting.
And they picked the losers. I mean, honest to God, it was an upside down world, topsy-turvy.
And I feel like I don't remember who exactly it was. It might have been Ian Calhoun that was telling me about this when we spoke to him, where at the time, and this would probably actually, your story would predate this a little bit, but there was this idea of like an English sounding speaker, a speaker for whatever type of genre of music. Like people were classifying speakers by some of the characteristics of their sound, but not by frequency response, not by anything like that. So maybe these musicians had a a musician sound that they were after, or something like that?
No, I interrogated musicians. Others have done this too, so I'm not the only person to ask the question and find this answer. Musicians look for acceptable variations in the timbre.
Acceptable variations in the timbre.
This, a cello. This doesn't have to sound like any particular cello, because there are various different violins and various different cellos and various different pianos, and they all have slightly different timbres. So if a loudspeaker added its own timbral signature to a recording of a particular instrument, their judgment would be, well, this is a valid interpretation of a cello. I'm not kidding.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's a totally different perspective from that of an audience a person in the audience.
They might have heard so many different ranges of a specific instrument that their acceptance criteria has just widened.
Well, possibly, yes. But they were interested in the music mainly anyway.
That's also fair. Yeah.
This is the other side of it. And I have no musical training, and so I'm a hardcore engineer, and for me this was just an interesting observation. They have a different perspective than I have, and it turns out that my perspective appreciates neutrality, and their perspective considers valid variations as being interesting. Just different kind of music.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway. This is all grist for the mill, isn't it? It's amazing how different people can be. In any event, people with relatively normal hearing, it's measured audiometrically, produce the most consistent results. I mean, their scores can be, plus minus 5%. I mean, from day to day, month to month, week to week. It's a remarkable consistency. Humans can be very, very good measuring instruments if you give them an opportunity. And giving them that opportunity means doing it blind, equal loudness, so they don't know what they're listening to. They don't know who said anything about it, what price it is, how it looks, and they're judging the sound only. And you randomize the presentations so that it's all judging the sound. It's very different from just walking into a store and using your eyes and ears together to shop.
And so you're talking about this initial, like the Friday listening sessions and all that.
Test, yes. Well, that was the beginning of it, because the first test was very crude. Yeah. And so about a month later, I was carrying on with my sound localization tests from that point on, and I used my KEF loudspeakers for that. And I couldn't let go of this. I mean, the correlation between subjective opinions and measurements on the one side, and the consistency with which people could recognize excellence, and if excellence is defined by a good measurement, it was amazing to me. And it was, back then and still now, people still say, well, we're all different. We all hear differently. So we all have to go shopping and find the loudspeaker you like. And what you like, I might not like. And that's where it ends. It's not a matter of debate anymore. It's just a matter of we hear differently. Well, It turns out that if our ears are both functioning, we probably won't disagree on what we like.
The choice or the difference might come to things that are not necessarily about the audio, but more potentially about the aesthetics or something else.
Yeah. If you're listening if being influenced by non-auditory factors, then it's anybody's game. Yeah. So about a month later, I set up a more carefully set up experiment, and had more people, more loudspeakers, enough to do crude statistical analysis of the results. And the results were basically the same. This time, one of the loudspeakers that was contributed to the test was contributed by the director of our division. And he hated them. They were tannoy, big, expensive tannoys, and he hated them. So here was a case where the man who has some influence in deciding what projects are worth pursuing in the way of research was a participant in a test that actually set up the reasons for this research. And so, not surprisingly, I got approval to do a little side research. I'm still to continue with the binaural stuff, but let's do a little more on this loudspeaker stuff, because here was an industry that, by all appearances, was operating without a set of rules.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be interesting if we could help this industry, which is worldwide, millions or billions of dollars, achieve some kind of standard format for designing, building loudspeakers? Let's just put some science behind it. I did a literature search and came up with lots and lots of opinions. My goodness gracious, you could find extensive verbiage from people with impressive backgrounds and education, but they were in the end opinions. This man says this, and this woman says that, and this person says something else, but they had no data. Nobody had bothered to do it, set up a double-blind or single-blind listening test, for God's sakes. So if you don't have any reliable scientific data, shut up.
Yeah.
So we had another meeting, and for a while, and it was clear that here was an industry that needed some help, and we thought we could help them.
Now, was there a big Canadian speaker industry at that point? Like, was there reputable Canadian speakers, or was this kind of?
It was very primitive. There were a couple of companies that made loudspeakers, but they were very good. So I started, and this is where another chance factor comes in. There's a man named Ernie Welling who was editor of a magazine called Electron. And this was just a general hobbyist magazine dealing with amateur radio and hi-fi and optics and building this and building that. I mean, it was really quite a broad spectrum of topics that this magazine would cover. But the man himself, Ernie, was interested in audio as a hobby, music especially. And so he called me one day and asked if I would be interested in contributing an article for his magazine about binaural hearing, how stereo might work. I didn't know how it did work, but I had some ideas about how it might work.
Yeah.
And so I said, sure. And I really was not an author of any note. In fact, the writing was very primitive, I thought. But turns out it wasn't half bad. And he said, any data is better than no data.
Yeah.
So could I publish some of these measurements on loudspeakers that I'm reviewing? Sure. There's reason to believe that the measurements mean something. I just can't tell you exactly what. And so we had the data, but the interpretation of the data was lacking. And we weren't sure even that we were collecting the right kind of data. So it was very early days. But anyway, one thing led to another. And so he started publishing reviews, and he would send me loudspeakers. Well, that was brisk for my mill because I needed loudspeakers.
To do your test, yeah. Yeah. So the magazine and its reviews were really beginning to help me. Ian Masters joined the editorial group at the time shortly after, and as a writer and co-editor. So I'm not sure what his role was, but he was a significant factor in my early career as an interface between me and the public, because I would write articles on various topics and interpreting science for lay people. So my name got to be known, and I would be writing about what I was doing at NRC. And so the work got to be known within the Canadian hi-fi hobbyist community, which included people who were aspiring manufacturers or existing manufacturers who aspired to be better. Yeah.
And so it was Ian who introduced Paul Barton to me in the NRC, and we know the Paul Barton story at PSD, and Axiom is another one, and then Paradigm came along. So as time passed, we had this lovely system of one my work and my data, and it was helping the magazines. The magazines would send me a product. They'd pay NRC forget what it was, a nominal sum of money. It was very reasonable. Covered the costs, basically. And we'd do the measurements on the loudspeaker. We'd set up a double-blind listening test. We'd put them through the double-blind listening test. They would not see any data at this point. They'd just hear sounds, not know what products they were listening to. And even if they would know that the products that they had submitted were in the tests, but we confused it by adding other products. So
Gotcha.
if they submitted 3 products, we put 2 or 3 more nondescript ones in, just to confuse them. So because when you do these tests, you're trying to guess what you're listening to.
Your assumptions are kind of taking hold of your opinions.
Yeah, that's right. So we try to just negate the assumptions. You can guess, but you're going to be wrong. That kind of thing. And eventually they came to accept this. In fact, it became a very comfortable experience. It's so comfortable. I mean, this is an interesting little anecdote, side note. One day, I constructed this very transparent, visually opaque, acoustically transparent, visually opaque screen. And somebody in the CBC wanted to use it in Toronto, so I didn't. They drove it down to Toronto. It turns out they had trouble timing. The timing was off, and they didn't get them back in Ottawa in time for these magazine listening tests. And so the people had arrived to do the listening tests, and the screens weren't here on the road. Yeah, so we thought about it. Well, they said, well, let's just start. We can ignore. We can ignore. We're professionals. We can ignore what we're listening to. Well, it's fascinating. We didn't get more than a couple of rounds into the listening test because the tests are done in repeated rounds with randomization. So you hear the same speaker several times, sequences and setups, so that it's not one opinion.
Yeah,
listening session. And we only got a couple or 3 sessions in and starting, and they just said, "No, let's stop. I can't do it. I know what I'm listening to." My opinions,
that's fascinating.
It was fascinating. Exactly. They felt very uncomfortable knowing what they were listening to. So we stopped the test, and the truck arrived, and we carried on after lunch and finished the test. But it was just amazing to me that these people, without any prompting, said, no, we can't do this. We're not comfortable forming opinions when we know what we're listening to. Stop the test.
I mean, journalistic integrity. That's good.
It is amazing. Well, I do think, looking back on it, and I don't know whether you've ever seen any of these Audio Scene Canada reviews, they were kind of one-page thing in format, one little box of measurements, anecdotal measurements, and a discussion of the results of the listening tests and a few descriptions of the product that we heard. I think those were really among the very best product reviews of loudspeakers I've ever seen, because you have accurate anecdotal data, not as comprehensive and done as well as we can do it now, but it was as good as it could be done at the time, and double-blind listening test results. Hello, who could ask for more? That's an effort, A for effort.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the magazines did well. The readership enjoyed my little articles, and they really enjoyed the product reviews. And I enjoyed having products to test and having subjective data to add to my catalog of my growing catalog of data for my research.
And just to kind of give us a time frame here, would this be closer to the end of the 70s, early 80s?
This would be in the 80s.
80s? Okay.
This is definitely.
Okay, so you've been doing this for quite some time at the NRC.
Well, I mean, the Ernie Welling thing started in the 70s. That's
okay.
And that was a very primitive one, but the really organized listening tests were in the 80s. And the manufacturers, the participation of the manufacturers, that was definitely in the 80s.
And so as you get kind of towards this, you're starting to deal with more of the magazines and the manufacturers start coming in. Are you still doing the binaural research as well?
No, that was history.
Yeah. So you essentially said this is now the interesting area to kind of research.
Yeah.
And you're going all in on speakers effectively, or sound.
It was the psychoacoustic relationship between what we measure and what we hear. It's the correct way to describe it. What do we learn from a set of data in terms of what we hear from the product that created that data?
Yeah.
And over time, it became clear that, in the beginning, I measured just the on-axis curve and a couple of off-axis curves. It became quite clear early on that the off-axis stuff mattered. You can't ignore it.
Yeah.
And yet most people were ignoring it. The BBC did research that, tended to focus on the on-axis. They pay attention to the off-axis as well. But really, the on-axis mattered most to them, because when I visited the BBC research department, their research had pretty much ended at the time. I picked up where they left off, kind of. But they were designing speakers for their small, very acoustically dead broadcast studios. And the product would sound best in that kind of acoustical environment at very close listening distances. It's not the kind of product you need in a typically reflective domestic listening room. Two different spaces. And so, the BBC, being the BBC, held a lot of sway, and there's still evidence of their influence in loudspeaker design. But gradually it's changed, and the success of the manufacturers in Canada became evident right away, in part because they were designing good products, but also in part because they had a story to tell.
Yep.
They had a story to tell their marketing people, their distributors, and their customers through advertising. These are speakers designed around scientific findings. They're designed to satisfy a golden ear. Or my opinion, it's not a personal thing at all. This is objective sound quality. It's good sound, period. And when people were brought to the lab to visit by these manufacturers, they would bring their groups of distributors and dealers around. They were really impressed because nobody else had this story to tell alone. And the one good thing about the Canadian manufacturers is that they were very collaborative. It's amazing. They were chummy with each other. Yeah, they were competing in the marketplace, but it came to a head a few years later when politicians decided that science was no longer as favorable for them as it used to be. And so they started cutting back our budgets, and we were encouraged to get financial assistance from the industries that we were serving. Yeah. This was a general statement to all of scientists within NRC. Most scientists would be left out in the cold faced with that sort of thing, but not me, because I was working with manufacturers.
You already knew them.
They were my buddies.
Yeah.
And so I looked at the situation, and we still had things we wanted to work on, and the budgets were being cut back, and we needed more money. We had to find new source of money. So I called a meeting of a whole bunch of our Canadian audio people. And they came, and we sat around this big conference table. It was fascinating because I presented the deal. They would form a non-profit consortium among some number of them themselves, and then NRC would put in an equal amount of money that they would put forward, and or the Canadian government would put forward an equal amount of money, and the NRC would provide facilities, me and a technician, there had the measurement equipment, so on. So all the hardware, all the facilities would stay there. It's kind of a freebie, but they would put in some money, and the government would put in the equal amount of money to hire staff to do the work. Well, it was one of the, there's more than one. Like, why would we do this? We're competing with each other. And so I had prepared for this moment, and I held up a recent issue of Stereo Review, or one of these American magazines. It was a catalog issue.
Yeah.
All the loudspeakers in circulation at that time. I said, there are 320 some loudspeakers here in this list from some large number of manufacturers. And I said, here you are, a dozen people sitting around the table. And if some number of you get together and learn something that these 200 others don't know, then that's an advantage.
Huge advantage.
Yes, I guess it is. So they agreed and went along with it. And the Athena project was born, and it was the first, I believe, I was told, it was the first collaboration between the National Research Council and Canadian industry.
And that was that's late 80s, early 90s?
I can't remember, 87 or so, 88, something like that.
That's amazing.
Anyway.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut it here for a second. And we have just kind of brought everything up from you getting started all the way to the Athena project kind of inception. So we'll end this episode because we're already probably at around time. And what we'll do is we'll pick up in a second episode and kind of go from the Athena project onwards, if that's okay with you.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Dr. Floyd Toole, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you, Jorden. I look forward to it.